I love 3D printing, but it enables you to have the ability to wake up one morning and decide it sounds like an incredible idea to build an entire life-size clone trooper to go with your battle droid, and then be able to just immediately start working on that project. So that's what we're doing today. Now there are two very distinct parts to this project, the clone armor and the body or mannequin that will be wearing said armor. Originally I thought I should work on printing the mannequin so that I could scale the armor to it appropriately, but both the armor and mannequin are designed to be an average built 6-foot tall male, so they should be fairly proportional to each other. I did put some of the armor and mannequin parts together digitally to double check, and everything was looking pretty good. The first thing we have to do is slice all of these armor pieces, and there's definitely not a shortage of them. Starting with the leg armor, both the shin and thigh plates are just kind of unusually shaped, and making a cut to these pieces to give the halves a flat edge to print from seemed like the best plan of attack. Bamboo Lab recently sent over their new H2S for me to try out, and I figured what better way to put a new machine to the test than with printing an entire suit of armor on it. I'll be using ABS for all of this armor because its post-processing benefits far outweigh its printing difficulty. The H2S shouldn't have any issue handling it though, since it is an enclosed machine with active chamber heating. Even though I'll be printing all of this armor in the same white filament, I still use the AMS because it means I can install multiple rolls of it and have the machine automatically switch to the next roll once one runs out. A super handy feature for a large project like this. I had the printer running off parts basically 24/7. When one finished, I'd send the next print job and just kept going. Once I'd accumulated a bucket of pieces, I figured it was time to start post-processing them. Now these prints honestly looked so good straight off of the printer, but for me, I always want to take these projects to the next level and strive to get things as screen accurate as possible, so we'll be sanding, priming, and painting everything. Starting with the sanding, I of course had to use one of my favorite foot sanders. Since these leg pieces were quite large on their own, I figured my best plan of attack would be to sand them before attaching the halves together while they were still smaller and more manageable to handle. With these parts all being ABS, they sanded beautifully and super easily. That is one of my main reasons for using ABS for all of my prop builds. The other is its ability to be used with acetone. Instead of using some adhesive, I get to chemically weld these pieces together for an even stronger bond, as well as smooth out the seam line and any other problem areas with some ABS slurry, which is just some ABS mixed into the acetone. It's how I recycle all of my support material from prints. Part of the reason I decided to start with the leg armor was because I knew they were going to take longer to get perfect looking due to those seams. I repeated those same steps for the thigh plates, first adding some acetone onto the flat edge to then attach the pieces and then go over the seam with some of my slurry to hopefully try and mask that seam line out perfectly. You always want to do this now when it's still raw ABS, because if you try to do this once you've added filler primer, the acetone will reactivate the filler primer and it will just kind of be a mess. I also went back on the pieces and sanded out that seam line where I'd added the slurry before then adding a couple of rounds of filler primer. I was really trying to get all of my sanding out of the way so that hopefully once I add the filler primer, it looks flawless as is and I really don't need to do much more work to these parts. After the legs, the next parts that I knew were going to need some extra work were the chest and back plates. These are the single largest armor parts in this entire build, so they are going to need splitting, not to mention being a pretty awkward shape to try and print in one piece. I placed the cut line somewhere that avoids any details or areas that wouldn't be as easy to smooth out later. For the chest plate, that was right under those angled sections, and after that it was just rotating the parts to get them to fit on the build plate, which tends to be on an angle like this. Unfortunately, the upper half of the chest still wouldn't quite fit at this 100% scale. It was so close though that I just cut off a little on one of the sides, which is my go-to little trick for things like chest plates. I know it's tempting to have it down the middle. Don't do that. This way it's much more structurally sound with being a majority solid piece, and it's going to be a lot easier to line up with the bottom section. And then I of course sent those two halves of the chest plate off to print as well, and it really doesn't get much more flawless of a print different job than this. I know white filament is always kind of hard to see well on camera, but this thing was seriously probably the best chest plate 3D print I've ever gotten. Just like with the leg pieces, I started by sanding the individual parts before then assembling them using acetone. I put the main halves together first and then let them sit for a bit before adding the smaller piece on the side, and then I let the entire chest plate sit for a bit before adding some body filler to the seam. I did use some of the acetone slurry, but I just felt like the seam was maybe going to be a bit too harsh without using something like body filler on it. But then I possibly did the worst body filler job I've ever done in my life, which I do fix. It looks really rough right now, but sanding is your best friend, and I was hoping that I'd manage to redeem myself with the back plate. At this point, you probably can guess it. First sanded the parts and then attached them using acetone. This time around, I did not feel like tempting my fate with the actual body filler and just used some spot putty instead. Once it had dried, I sanded it down and then added a couple of rounds of filler primer. While I was keeping busy in the garage, sanding and painting and working on all of those armor parts, the H2S was still busy printing the rest of the Clone Trooper armor. None of the other armor pieces required any assembly or had any seams that I needed to tackle, so I was hoping that I could do a really thorough sanding job, a couple of layers of filler primer, and pretty much call it a day. And for the most part, this did actually end up working out, which was amazing because there are a lot of individual armor pieces to deal with. I felt like I was sanding forever, but then all of a sudden I basically had an entire Clone Trooper armor set completed. It did also help that all of these prints turned out so clean, so I wasn't having to sand away any printer defects. If I needed to do touch-ups, I did do that. It was mostly on the parts that did have those seams though, and I really just wanted to make sure that I was making that seam line completely disappear on the part. The final armor piece that I had to tackle was the helmet. This had no problem fitting in one piece on the H2S, which is going to make my post-processing life a whole lot easier. And for anyone curious, this helmet took just over a day and a half to complete. And it was another exceptional looking 3D print. Now, I actually wouldn't use organic supports for something like a helmet, but when I simulated the difference between organic and just regular snug supports, the organic took less time and filament, so I figured let's try it this time around. They came off really easily, and overall the overhangs were looking pretty clean. I did decide to use some acetone on some of the rougher overhang areas before doing any sanding, just to try and smooth those out first. And once that had dried, it was then, of course, onto the sanding. And then the filler primer, because I am a creature of habit. But this was legitimately the final armor piece, and once I was happy with the smoothness of all of the parts, I first do a round of 400 grit sanding across the entire piece, mostly to knock off any possible overspray and just have the parts being as smooth as possible before adding paint. Which, speaking of, for all of these parts, I started with this flat white. Clone armor is supposed to be between a matte and satin finish, and I was originally going to just go straight in with a satin paint, but this stuff I've had really good experience with. It really doesn't drip, it's super easy to use, I like the spray on it, so I thought the best plan of attack for me would be to spray everything in the flat white first, and then do a final coat of the satin, and that way if the satin at full strength was maybe a bit too shiny for my liking, I could do more of a lighter coat across all of the parts. So once I had an entire white suit of armor, I then went in with the satin paint to do another coat over all of these pieces. This isn't actually a terrible idea anyway, because there being a couple of more coats of paint on these parts means that they're more scratch resistant if you were using this for a costume. If you were planning on wearing it, you'd probably want to clear coat it with something just to make it even more scratch resistant, but thankfully I don't have to worry about that. The helmet is the one armor piece that requires a bit more painting done to it. I started off with the gray areas, which includes the teeth, the ears, and also the stripe around the back of the helmet. Technically, I could have masked the stripe off, and that would have possibly been easier than doing it in reverse, but didn't think of that in time, and this ended up working out fine. Once the gray had dried, I then went ahead and removed some of the masking tape. I realized I was going to have to mask a bunch of the same areas, so I left some of the tape there just to give myself a little more protection to make sure I didn't accidentally overspray on the nice pristine white, because next on the painting to-do list is the black brim that goes around the entire helmet, and also the central back panel. And once again, once that paint had dried, I went ahead and removed the masking tape, all of it this time. Next up were the side stripes, which there are actually 3D printable stencils that you can make yourself, and I just ended up taping those into place. Originally, I wasn't sure if I was going to use these because I didn't know how well they would work with the recessed stripes, but this turned out really well and super convenient and easy to use. So if you ever find yourself making one of these Phase 2 Clone Trooper helmets, I'd highly recommend printing off the templates. And the last bit of painting I needed to do was this bottom mouthpiece in black. I don't know what possessed me to attach this to the helmet beforehand. It would have been so much easier to have kept it separate and painted it black separately. So an example of what not to do. And then it was on to the finishing touches on this helmet, starting with this metal mesh that goes behind the teeth. This I just hot glued into place. And then it was on to the visor. This also has a printable template that I would highly recommend making. The template is the exact size of the hole opening though, so you do want to extend this when you trace it onto the visor material. And this I also hot glued into place, and it's just impossible to film with my hands all up on the inside of the helmet. And lastly was gluing on the aerators, which thankfully I did decide to keep separately because they were a whole lot easier to paint. And the final thing that I wanted to do to all of this armor was weather it. I started off with some physical weathering using a combination of some really rough sandpaper and some scouring and metal sponge pad things. Very scientific, but this I mostly ran along just any of the high points. I kept in mind the individual pieces that I was working on. So for instance, the hand plates were pretty banged up since that would be what gets scuffed the most, but things like the shoulder bells, not as much. The back plate didn't have a great deal, although I still wanted it to have the same weathering effect so that none of this armor looked particularly new. And that's just my personal aesthetic preference. I know weathering is a very subjective part of the painting process, but personally, I've been keeping a lot of my collection looking exactly like that. I would like to give Luthen Rail a run for his antiquity shop money. So having these parts looked all lived in and like they're being preserved in my collection is the vibe I tend to be going for. And then it was on to the painting part of the weathering process, in which I mixed up some of my infamous dirty paint water. In the clone's case, this was a mixture of black and gray paint. I like to stick to the more craft type of paint because it's already more of a liquidy consistency, and then you just add a whole lot of water to that mixture. Personally, I prefer to run this through an airbrush, but you absolutely could brush this on as well. The airbrush is just quick and easy. It's pretty foolproof. I feel like anytime I would think about applying this using a brush, it would possibly run the risk of there being some sort of visible brush stroke somewhere on the armor, whereas if I don't quite get to some of these splattered areas fast enough on the armor pieces and they maybe look a bit darker than they should, that texture still looks a whole lot more natural than a brush stroke. So I went ahead and applied that to all of the armor parts. I know it always looks crazy, but it is literally better for the parts if you apply it wet so that it doesn't accidentally dry too quickly before you have a chance to blot it and wipe it off to your desired effect. You do see me also spritzing some extra water on parts if I feel like it's maybe sticking and staining the white surface a little too much. Since this was a satin finish paint, it really wasn't too bad with overstaining, which I guess is another benefit of not sticking to the matte finish. You can always tweak your water to paint ratio. I would say that it's significantly better for your mixture to be too watery than too opaque, because you can always go in with another round of this weathering, darken up some of those deeper recessed areas, but it's really hard to go back if you overdo it. The weathering was really the last step for this armor, which means we should probably start talking about the second part to this project, the mannequin. So this entire time while I was outside working on this armor, I had multiple 3D printers working on the mannequin for me. The entire concept of a 3D printed mannequin is so cool, especially because this one by Big Fred Customs is entirely posable, so it's like printing a giant articulating action figure, which I'm sure you can imagine involves a lot of pieces, especially for all of those posable joints. All of the parts go together with a mixture of various hardware. There are some pretty great instructions that come with the mannequin, so I'm not going to be going into great detail through this entire process because honestly, you'd all probably think I was a mad scientist with putting this body together. I had limbs strewn about my workshop for multiple days. I will just say though, it did seem like an overwhelming amount of pieces that go into this mannequin, but all of the joints work off of the same design concept, so once you figure out how to build one of them, you're just repeating that for like the hips, the elbows, the shoulders, all of that stuff. So it does become a lot more manageable, and you pretty much will not need to look at the instructions by the time you're finished this thing because you'll become so used to putting those parts together. But there was one piece that I had to work on that was a bit in between the mannequin and the actual armor, and that was the boot situation. I did think about printing the mannequin feet and then measuring and buying boots specifically for the mannequin, but then I thought it might be cooler to have this clone project be fully 3D printed. So I found a 3D model for the clone boots. I scaled it to look appropriate for the mannequin as well as with the rest of the armor, and then I added the ankle piece of the mannequin to the boot model so that the mannequin legs can just attach directly to these 3D printed boots. I know it sounds kind of crazy, but this honestly ended up working out so well. These boots looked absolutely perfect, and especially with the weathering afterwards, you would never know that they were 3D printed shoes. I did have the mannequin standing up on its own, but with the weight of all of the armor I'm about to add to this body, I knew it would be best to use the back support piece that you add a pole to. I quickly whipped up this base design for the pole, printed it super heavy, like literally this was almost 2 kilograms of filament. The pole just sits into this, and hopefully this will help stabilize the mannequin. Before we start adding the armor, I first need to dress the mannequin in his undersuit, and then just generally figure out a plan of attack, which my solution was laying this body down on the ground and slipping the leg armor on. He couldn't stand up without his feet, and I couldn't put the feet on until the leg armor was on his body, so this was the situation. And then I skipped about 5 steps at once. I know, I'm sorry. I was trying to figure out where everything needed to sit on his body on top of fighting with the back pole attachment. Thankfully I could fit it under the back plate and just leave the back ab plate off, but it was dicey there for a bit. Thankfully the armor is also fitting him pretty well though so far. The one thing that I decided to do was pad the shoulders with some stuffing. Because of how the joints are set up, he just basically doesn't have shoulders, and therefore I would have like no good place to attach the shoulder bells. The other part that needed some finessing was the belt. Again, sticking with the fully 3D printed theme, the back plate for this that would then become a fully closed loop just could not go on the body with the pole right there. So I added the straps to the belt so that I could just tie it back there. I know, not my finest work, but you pretty much are never going to see this back part anyway on display, so you're going to be the only ones that know what's happening back there. I still went ahead and added all of the belt boxes that go on those in-between seam areas, using some of this sticky tack to keep them in place. I then went ahead and problem solved one half of this armor situation to figure out how everything was going to be attaching. The thigh plate has a piece of strapping that I attached to it that then goes up into the butt plate and velcros in place. The butt plate is very securely being held on by the pole, like it barely fits. So these shouldn't be slipping down anytime soon. As for the knee, I created some straps so that I could still have it be flexible and just attach this similar to how you would on your own body. Undid the Velcro off of one side, put that around the mannequin knee, and then put the Velcro back into place. And this also likes staying exactly where it wants to, so no extra strapping needed there. The shoulder bells get attached by a very professional piece of industrial stick Velcro. I would not trust this if you were planning on wearing it, but for display purposes, this worked well. For the remainder of the arm armor, I added another piece of strapping, this time into the inside of the chest plate, that then has pieces of Velcro on it that then attach to the inside of the various parts of the arm pieces. This just means that the bicep, elbow armor, and forearm armor are all hanging exactly where they should be on this mannequin. On an actual person, I bet a lot of this armor would probably really like staying in place, but the mannequin just kind of had skinny little arms compared to the armor. Lengthwise, it did fit pretty fantastically though. And the last bit of armor to deal with were the hand plates. So first I had to dress the hands in these gloves, which is just such an awkward thing to try and do. Thankfully, these hands are fully articulating, so it wasn't as difficult as I'm sure it probably could be if this was like a solid static hand. And I also attached these using that same stick-on industrial Velcro. Truly, this stuff is a lifesaver for costumes. With the armor all being together, I did a bit of a weathering check just to make sure that everything looked like it matched. I also went in with a brush just to darken up some areas more, and then all that was left was adding the helmet. And here is the finished clone trooper. Maybe one day I'll commit to a particular battalion, but for now I really love the simplicity of the fully white armor, and it goes well with my standard battle droid. I also printed out a phase 1 helmet so that I can switch between the two if I want, but I left finishing it for another day. The final filament usage came out to about 13 kilograms for the mannequin, 15 if you include the base, and about 10 kilograms for all of the armor. Not that I was trying for some sort of speed record, but I somehow managed to pull this off in 2 weeks. Thank you for joining me throughout the process of this insane build, and I guess let me know your ideas for how you think I should try to outdo this project. But that is everything. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.